Welcome to our second lecture, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations, you obviously made it through the first, and here we are at the second. So in this particular presentation, we'll be discussing the early Christian church, and specifically how music evolves in that setting. Also, the church fathers, so some individuals who were very important to the growth of the church and how they affected music, as well as some different chant types, because believe it or not, there were many types of chant before Gregorian chant, which is what most of us are familiar with, was invented, and I say that in quotes. So here on this first page, we have some examples of Gregorian chant as well as Mozarabic chant. That's the one on the right, and then a lovely sort of stained glass appearance of St. Augustine, who's one of our church fathers. The early church grows up in Rome, ladies and gentlemen, which you might be aware of. And of course, some of the individuals responsible for that are who we call the apostles in our faith. And we know that they traveled both within the Greek and Roman empires, particularly Peter and Paul. And Peter, as many of you might be aware, formed the center for the church in the city of Rome. And as of course we would think, this was an extremely wise decision on Peter's part. It was, of course, the center of the Roman Empire and had an extremely elaborate way of communication, trade, and government. And these connections later are going to serve the church quite well. This graphic I'm showing you right now is one of the great Roman buildings in the Parthenon. Now, the early Christians did not have an easy time of it when they first established themselves in Rome. Caesar at the time, Caesar Augustus, persecuted the Christians very much, and the reason for that was actually politically motivated. As emperor, he was seen as one of the many gods in the pagan system of worship that the Romans ascribed to. And as a god, he was infallible and could demand as many taxes as he liked. So this new religion really threatened Augustus's power as well as his tax collections. And the Christians highly rejected the emperor because he was not their god. So in light of that, they were made sport of in the Colosseum, which I'm sure many of you have seen in various movies, for example, Gladiator. They were literally fed to lions and generally blamed for any bad luck that befell Rome, so they were sort of the outcasts of Roman society. And under those circumstances, understandably, the Christians eventually went into hiding. And when they wanted to meet to have services, they met in private homes of Romans who were sympathetic to their cause. And sometimes, when they couldn't find those, they would go into subterranean burial places like mausoleums to worship, which had, of course, very interesting acoustics. The early Christians were wanting to establish themselves as different from the rest of the Roman Empire and the Roman system of religion. Therefore, they rejected a lot of the music that was associated with Roman government and religion. And things like that would be including trumpets and drums and generally warfare-like sounding instruments. And the reason for that, if you think about it, if you want to hide from the government, you really don't want to be playing things that are too loud. So trumpets and drums are also not a good idea for that reason. The early Christians also rejected Jewish synagogue music because they were also trying to differentiate themselves from Jews, who they were very close to in the beginnings of their religion. As I've discussed in previous lectures, Roman society was inherited from Greek society because the Romans went and conquered the Greeks and then basically used all their information. So musical and scholarly culture were quite similar. Romans read many different articles in Greek about culture and Greek beliefs. And as I mentioned, Romans made great use of brass and military instruments, as well as the Greek instrument, the aulus. This was a wind instrument, almost like a double reed instrument, and very sort of bombastic and loud. As I mentioned, Christians didn't sort of take up a lot of these Roman instruments because they did not want to be found out by the government. So the earliest reports of Christian music in early services are of singing, and what we call chanting, or perhaps singing many words on the same note, and recitation of the gospel texts. Another thing that's reported in early Christian services is the singing of hymns. And many of us think of the four-part hymns with organ that we probably hear in our churches today. Hymn singing in this time was actually monophonic, which means it was single line, unison, with no harmony. But it was very important because it gave emphasis to the emotional and sacred texts, which were not from the Bible. These are generally the texts which make up hymns, and they're usually written by Christians or Christian scholars. Another reason, guys, for the recitation of text on a single note is that if you think about some of the places the Christians were having their services, this is going to make words and Gospels texts easier to hear. They're definitely having services in very interesting acoustical spaces, such as mausoleums and burial grounds, and that can be difficult to hear people speak, but if you're singing, the sound will carry further and generally will also be heard better. So that's a reason why they did that. Chanting and singing also makes speech stand out from everyday communication, and of course Christians would want to do that with the gospel texts. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, ladies and gentlemen, the Roman Empire as it existed was cut into halves of East and West. And when it falls and the medieval period begins, the portion which falls is in the West. However, we have a whole history of how the cutting in half occurred. And a lot of that has to do with the Emperor Constantine, who was active or alive from about 272 to 337 Common Era. And I have a graphic here to show you. This is coinage of the time and has his face on one side and then him conquering the city of what becomes to be known as Constantinople. Today, this is Istanbul in Turkey. So how this all occurs? We know that in 324, Constantine in fact had conquered this region and renamed the city of what was called Byzantium, after himself, of course, Constantinople. And previous to this, in the year 313, he issued a very important edict called the Edict of Milan. And this, in fact, legitimized Christianity. And the reason for doing this was actually politically motivated, yet again. While trying to conquer the eastern half of the empire, he already had the west, but Constantine, of course, wanted more. So while in the process of conquering that half, Constantine had a dream which dealt with a floating cross. It looks slightly different than the cross that we see nowadays in church. But above this cross were the words, "In hoc signo vinces," which means, "In this sign you shall conquer." This is also, by the way, sort of a weird non sequitur, guys, but this is also the logo for Pall Mall cigarettes, and I know because I saw them in Europe all over the place a few years ago. And like, oh, I wonder why Constantine's on those particular set of cigarettes. Kind of strange. But after this, Constantine told his armies to paint their shields with this cross image that he'd seen and realized it was connected to Christianity. The day for the battle came for the eastern city of Byzantium, and he won and gained control of what remained of the Eastern Empire. And therefore, Constantine decided that he should give some credence to the religion which had apparently put him in power. Since the year 300 AD, Christians had been persecuted and destroyed, actually even before that, as Romans were pagans, as I mentioned. And the edict that Constantine issued in 313 now said that Christians are free from persecution and they are free to practice their religion in safety. So Christian churches are now free to come out into the open, establish themselves, and Christian institutions, such as universities, like APU, are now free to own and buy property. So this is an important shift for Christianity as a religion. Eventually this leads to the founding of churches, the founding of monasteries, and the founding of universities. The city that Constantine founded in the east, as I mentioned, became known as Constantinople, and it was still known by some people as Byzantium, who refused to take the new name. It is now Istanbul in Turkey today. Constantine was a very pragmatic pagan, and he continued to worship the sun god and carry out many war campaigns throughout his death, but allowed his subjects to practice Christianity, and then he was baptized as a Christian right before he died. The emperor after Constantine was Theodosius, and his reign is generally viewed as the beginning of Christendom. In terms of church and in terms of music, Byzantium, or Constantinople, was one of the biggest and most powerful forces in the world. It was also very culturally sophisticated because it was influenced by Asia and the Arab world due to its geographic location. And Byzantium, or Constantinople, whichever you prefer, existed as a political power until 1453 when the Turks and the Crusaders destroyed it. From the ruins then rose the city which we know as Istanbul today in Turkey. Incredibly cultured and interesting city. This graphic I have up here for you actually is a remembrance of all these crusades and the destruction of Istanbul, or of Constantinople in those times. As we know, Western Rome and the Roman Empire then ceased to exist as a political power because of the age of migrations. This is when all of these barbarian tribes came into Italy, who deposed the young emperor. Different Germanic tribes come in, the Visigoths seize the whole region. And eventually, of course, the Pope is established in Rome and becomes one of the most important figures in the world, a Western world at least, for Christianity. In the East, the Byzantines, who are also Christian, become known as the Orthodox Church, while the western half of the world becomes known as the Catholic Church. So we have two different kind of strains of Christianity going on here. Also, a word about identity, ladies and gentlemen. It's very different than today when we say, I'm an American. Now, in this time period, we don't have countries, but we do have regions, and people have more of a sense of belonging to a city or a region where there are established bishops and local culture, instead of a country like we do today. Because of geographical isolation, each Christian region in Western Europe developed its own way of chanting a worship service. So each had, in fact, a different type of singing and chant. And this all occurred up until the year 1000. There are 6 different types of liturgy, all of them learned by complete oral tradition. Most things are not written down, or at least not written down in a way that's easily understandable. So, one of the first types is Celtic chant. As you guys might be able to guess, this was developed and used in Ireland and Scotland and has a lot in common with some of the folk music from those regions as well, a lot of flat sevenths, etc. Gallic chant was developed in the northern provinces of the Roman Empire and the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne. So Germany, France, Switzerland, also those regions. And we see as well in Gallic chant that there is some influence from Byzantine style and from the Celtic tradition. So nothing exists in a vacuum, ladies and gentlemen. That's most of the reminder I want to give you. These chants would have traveled by way of trade routes, and then later on they're all replaced by, first of all, a type of chant which is very close to Gregorian, called Roman chant. And now that I'm talking about that, let's discuss Old Roman chant. This is probably the oldest singing we know of in Rome and existed before what we call Gregorian chant. We know that some of it was transmitted in manuscripts as late as the 10th and 11th century, and that's about 1,000 years after we think it started. So very, very old singing. Some melodies are preserved before they were replaced and then used as a basis for Gregorian chant, and this is where we think Gregorian chant really originates. We also have Mozarabic chant. This kind of sounds like mozzarella cheese. But this was a type of chant that was used in Spain and the Spanish-speaking lands, including Portugal, the region that we know as Portugal today. Much of it is preserved in some of their manuscripts, but it was not written on a musical staff. It looks a lot like squiggly lines, and scholars really can't very easily decipher it for that reason. In fact, if you guys look closer at the graphic, this does contain some Mozarabic chant, and it's just sort of written above in squiggly lines. You can't really read anything unless you already know the oral tradition. This chant, Mozarabic chant, came about in 633 when there was a council in the city of Toledo, because everyone sort of had different styles of singing, and Toledo wanted to standardize the chant that was performed in the regions that spoke Spanish and make it into a service. So during this council, Mozarabic chant was invented, again in quotes, sort of gave a name to it. Many people are confused by the name. In fact, it sounds like the word Arabic is in it. It's in fact not derived from Arabic influence, though. There were a lot of Arabic people living in Spain at the time, and in fact, the chant means false Arab. So kind of an interesting side note there. And this type of chant was again replaced in the 11th century by the Gregorian repertory. Benedictine chant is yet another type, and was developed in southern Italy, regions of Sicily, etc., and influenced by the East through trade routes. We also think it was probably being sung in North Africa and in Greece. Again, geographically, that makes a lot of sense. And the last type is Ambrosian chant, which originates in the city of Milan, so in northern Italy. And this was a very politically powerful city that more or less rivaled Rome, and was named after the bishop Ambrosius, who was very, very powerful and very well connected. He introduced, in fact, responsorial singing from Byzantium. And this was something he had heard himself, where you have a call and response. So he wanted to use this in his own church services. And he felt it was a very useful type of singing for performing chant, especially for performing the Psalms. So scholars believe that Ambrosian chant probably influenced Old Roman chant, as some of the chants are pretty similar. Both often seem to begin with the same original melody and then deviate from there. But we tend to notice that Ambrosian chant is either more elaborate or much more simple than Roman chant, so it's sort of a bit of a difference there. Unlike the other types of chant, such as Celtic, Gallic, etc., Ambrosian chant is not entirely wiped out by Gregorian chant as easily because of the strong city culture and the powerful bishop of Milan. So it kind of sticks around for a while longer than some of these others and eventually fades out, but is much more long-lived than the other types of chant during this period. I'd like to make a few final comments about Byzantium, ladies and gentlemen, before we leave that subject entirely. And part of the reason is to let you know where our current church traditions come from, especially the modes, which I have listed up here for you. So the Greeks came up with the modal system, as we're aware. Pythagoras, in fact, is often credited with it. From there, Greece is also conquered and warred upon by Byzantium. So the Byzantines take what they've learned from the Greeks and use it in their own church services. The Christian church in the East influences the Christian church in the West. So we have Western Rome also using what now come to be called the church modes. Another influence from Byzantium is the style of singing, which I referred to in a previous slide. It's largely what we call responsorial. That means that you have a call and response between either a soloist and a larger group, or between two groups. And this tradition is still quite strong in many Christian churches today, especially in pieces that seem natural as call and response, such as psalms and antiphons. Another discussion question for you to toss back and forth, ladies and gentlemen, about all these ideas I've been putting forth about different kinds of chant, such as Gallic, such as Celtic, etc. Do you think this oral tradition of chant was pretty fixed? Or do you think people were still kind of changing it around and it was always constantly evolving, becoming another version? Do you think there was an original version? Or do you think there was simply a rough version that constantly changed? And oral tradition this time, of course, is very, very important. In our own time, the biggest oral tradition we seem to have is the radio. But in this time, it was life and death. So think about some of these things and how that might have affected the way that chant evolved. As I mentioned, all of these types of chant, the 6 types I mentioned, have gone away and have been rid of in favor of Gregorian chant. And the man who instituted a lot of those changes was Charlemagne, or Karl der Grosse, as the Germans call him, Charles the Great. He was the king of the Franks. The Franks were another barbarian group, and Charlemagne was the heir to the throne of the Franks because he was the son of Pippin III. Charlemagne's dates are 742 through 814, or at least that's when he was reigning, from what we can tell. The Franks were, in fact, remains of the barbarians who had destroyed the Western Roman Empire that I spoke of. And that is rather remarkable that then Charlemagne becomes a ruler of the same territory. The land of the Franks includes parts of France and Germany, including areas called the Black Forest of Germany. If any of you have ever been to the Black Forest, you may know why it is called the Black Forest. It's because the trees grow so thickly that if you go in at 12 noon in the middle of the day and drive in there, it's actually pitch black like night. So great place to hide if you're a barbarian tribe. Charlemagne had aspirations to conquer, again, the entire region of what had been the old Roman Empire, and he was approached by Pope Leo III of Italy. The Pope was being attacked by other barbarians, and he approached Charlemagne for aid in fighting them off. In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. Leo had in fact made up this title to appeal to Charlemagne and to give him Christian sanction for his actions. This was actually a much bigger deal than we might imagine, ladies and gentlemen. Christian sanction meant he could pretty much do anything he wanted to, and the church would back him up. And this was very important in this early time. To be excommunicated was to be sentenced to death, pretty much. So to have this much support of the church behind you was a very big deal. So this was a title that was made up by the Pope to basically pay Charlemagne back for helping Leo III fight off these barbarians who were attacking the Vatican at this time. At the end of Charlemagne's reign, his territory in fact does include everything that was in the former Old Roman Empire. So he truly does create another empire of his own and is still known today as the first Holy Roman Emperor. On this next slide, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be talking a bit about Charlemagne, as well as a bit about the early church fathers, and continuing with them on the next couple of slides. So a few more ideas about Charlemagne, things he wanted to gain back, particularly since he had just conquered the remains of the old Roman Empire. He wanted to gain a lot of the old Roman ideals back. Education, the speaking of Latin. And this is referred to by many art scholars this time period as the Carolingian Renaissance. So if you ever see anything that says Carolingian legend or Renaissance, this is the time of Charlemagne. The reason for the need of education during this time was that between the years 300 and 800, many people had become quite illiterate. Normally because of class distinction, not a lot of opportunity for the lower classes. And so Charlemagne reintroduces the idea of actual schools. And he also insists that his assistants learn to read and write as well. He wants to be surrounded by educated people. And the other really important change for music historians that Charlemagne instituted was to make sure that all churches conducted the same liturgy. Now, this is a pretty big feat. He decided that the old Roman style of chant liturgy was the proper one, and said to the rest of his territories, "We will perform the Mass in this manner." As I said, this is a complicated feat, so he sent out what is called the Schola Cantorum, which means the School of Singers. They had previously existed as a choir to the Pope. They were all extremely talented singers and monks, and they went out to each of the territories and taught their way of singing Roman chant to all the priests and deacons of the church. Understandably, this took many generations. Singing was the way to conduct services in Europe at this time, so this was very much expected of all the members of the clergy. Until now, all 150 of the Psalms had been learned by oral tradition, and Charlemagne is also the first to encourage the copying of a music notation. Now, it's not the notation that we know today. It's not the 4-line staff which Guido d'Arezzo later comes up with, nor the 5-line staff that we're used to. But he encourages the copying of types of squiggles that indicate whether you should sing a phrase up or down, and other basic types of notation. So moving on to the Church Fathers, ladies and gentlemen. The first one I'd like to discuss is the Apostle Paul, or St. Paul if you're Catholic. He was one of the most important figures of the early Christian church, and I'm sure most of you know that from reading scripture and seeing all the letters that he wrote. He was originally a Jew who converted to Christianity and dedicated himself to spreading Christianity through the Near and Middle Eastern areas. What he tells us that's useful is that in early Christian services, when Christians get together to worship, despite rejecting synagogue music, they still carry on some traditions from the Jewish church, the Jewish temple. They do a lot of the same things that Jews did in their services, which is the singing and chanting of psalms. So originally a Christian service would have involved pretty much that, and perhaps some gospel readings. St. Ambrose is another one of the church fathers who's very important to us. We know he was writing at about 370 Common Era in Milan, and he wrote specifically about being attacked by more politically powerful individuals, sometimes members of the church that didn't agree with his way of doing things. And he finds a technique that encourages his worshippers in Milan not to abandon Christianity nor to abandon what he's teaching them. And he described it as singing taken from the Eastern Church. So literally, as he's writing this, people are beating on the doors of the Duomo in Milan and demanding that he and his worshippers come out and answer for themselves. And in order to calm down his worshippers and to create a sense of piety, he comes up with the idea of the hymn. So he's credited with that. Hymns, as you might remember, are religiously based texts which are not taken from the Bible, and they were sung in a responsorial manner by the congregation. This is fairly unusual. Most singing in the church occurs within the clergy, not within the congregation. So Ambrose may have been one of the unique fathers to have this within his church. In a few generations, of course, the hymns being sung in a responsorial manner becomes a cornerstone of Christian liturgy. And the typical pattern of service where you would find Christian music would involve this: an antiphon, which is something in the form of a chorus with several verses, and then a closing chorus. So you have, again, a very good opportunity for some responsorial singing there. A hymn, which would have been performed probably first verse all together, then second verse one half of the congregation, third verse the other half of the congregation, and then the closing statement together. And then quite probably a psalm, which also would have been sung in a responsorial manner, back and forth, trading off from the soloist to the chorus. Moving on with the other church fathers, let's take a look at Saint Benedict, or the Apostle Benedict, whichever you prefer. In 529, Benedict sent out for a life of poverty. He was actually a very well-to-do citizen from a noble family. So he, much like St. Francis of Assisi, looked around him really for the first time and was very disgusted by the poverty and chaos of Italy that he saw. He gave all of his wealth away and became a hermit in the desert, living by his own means, which meant that he grew his own crops and raised his own animals and was very self-sufficient. And after a while, word spread of this crazy nobleman who had become a hermit in the desert. Other people observed him and then asked to learn his ways and live with him. And what this develops is the first monastery, the first Western monastic order of Benedict. Now we have monasteries of various orders, but the Benedictine monasteries were the original ones. This idea of Benedict's to be very self-sufficient was new and unique because in the 6th century, of course, as I mentioned, Europe had been fraught with barbarian invasions. There's no source of food. Oftentimes, if you grow a source of food, it's then taken away from you by the barbarians. So, the monks grew their own crops, had their own animals, lived in their own commune, and had walls around them to protect them from any kind of invasion. Benedict truly believed this was the way to go, to be self-sufficient, and God helps those who help themselves. He also set up a structure for the monks to live their daily lives, and he structured the day into concise periods that alternate between prayer, work, and rest. And the rule for this is the rule of Saint Benedict, which means to work and to pray. Ora et labora is how that is said in Latin. So he works this rule into a schedule. And incidentally, when we say work and pray, prayer in this time period meant the recitation of the Psalms, the 150 holy texts of the Old Testament that are attributed to David. Benedict felt this was the best way to pray, and it was done in a chant-like fashion, so music was definitely involved here. This is resulting in some of the first Christian monastic music. And what grows out of the rule of Saint Benedict, this ora et labora, is what is later known as the office, and we will look at that in detail in a few more slides. Now, talking about St. Augustine. St. Augustine was present in about 6th century Common Era, and if you guys haven't read his book Confessions, it's really a fascinating book to check out for many reasons, because Augustine shows himself to be so incredibly human, and that's very comforting. When he first was among the others of the world, he was very much a playboy and belonged to a Gnostic sect of philosophers called the Manichaeans, who saw nothing wrong with partying, with having all kinds of different sexual partners. It was simply part of their belief system. Then Benedict had a religious conversion experience and moved from Carthage, where he had been with the Manichaeans, to Italy, and here became one of the church doctors of the Christian faith. In Confessions, Augustine quotes that one of the most critical moments of his conversion was the attendance of a service, which included the singing of hymns and psalms. And he's one of the first Christians to be very adamantly pro-music. And he gives us one of the great quotes about music that we have today, which is that music conveys what words cannot. Augustine is still cautious of music because he feels some guilt over his enjoyment of the Psalms. And then we go back to that old feeling that we get from Aristotle. Again, you must be cautious of music because of its power. And of course, the Christian take on that is, if it makes me feel good, perhaps it's bad. And of course, we can trace that back to Augustine's early life. He learned that everything that had made him feel good with the Manichaeans was bad in the new Christian faith. So, he still feels some guilt and distraction over the enjoyment of the Psalms, but is very much representative of the next 1,000 years of Christian opinion on music. It's a wonderful addition to the service, yet we must be careful with it. So one of our last church fathers is Saint Gregory, or Pope Gregory, and he, of course, is the man from whom we get the name Gregorian chant. From here on out, this is the only type of chant that we're going to be studying and looking at, especially in your anthologies. And the name Gregorian chant is taken from Pope Gregory I, who was pope from the year 590 to about 604. He was a very fine administrator and one of the best popes, in fact. One of his major successes is that he succeeded in consolidating liturgy. Again, masses are still under the rule after Charlemagne of trying to have the same liturgy, and it's this old Roman chant. However, Gregory is able to really continue that consolidation. He also made very specific rules for the clergy that they had to learn how to sing well, not just sort of stumble through the masses and sort of not sing too well. Carolingian legend, that is connected with Charlemagne, holds that Gregory was supposedly dictated the melodies, which now comprise Gregorian chant, by the Holy Spirit in the person of a dove. The story is that Gregory had been singing the melodies to a scribe, and the scribe was behind a screen, so he couldn't see Gregory. But after a while, the scribe got kind of bored and didn't hear much from Gregory in terms of singing, so he peeked behind the screen and saw that there was a dove on Gregory's shoulder, and that the dove was singing the melodies into Gregory's ear. So this graphic I have is meant to be a representation of that, although Gregory wouldn't have been writing the Psalms down himself, as he's been shown to do here. The likely reality, despite this wonderful myth, is that the chant developed slowly and over time from the old Roman chant that Charlemagne had been trying to institute. So Gregory realized that consolidating this chant is a good way to keep consistency within the church. He also was well known for establishing orphanages which were devoted to the training of singers, who might then later become monks and serve the church. So our next graphic, ladies and gentlemen, on this slide is a statue of Guido d'Arezzo. You notice he's holding a page of music. Guido, of course, was a mathematician and a musician and lived in the city of Arezzo, Italy. He is our friend. You may remember we've talked about him a bit already, and he'll continue to be our friend. We'll learn even more about him as we continue on with this class. So Guido is especially our friend right now because he comes up with the diastemic or four-line staff, as well as the idea of a movable C clef. And this is our first real notation that looks anything like our notation today. So these different C clefs could be put on the different lines of the staff, and that would help you depending on how high or low your chant was. And this was the way that people began to notate music during the time of Guido. Fast forward to the early 1900s, in the Benedictine monastery of Solesmes, the monks decided that there was a whole lot of Gregorian chant, and they kind of wanted to do some house cleaning with it. So the monks of this monastery dedicated themselves to finding one very pure version of each chant, because there were several different versions of many chants. For years, they compiled different versions of the chants and came up with that special pure version. And in their printing of these pure chants, they also decided to use Guido's four-line staff because they felt it looked more medieval and more authentic. In the 1930s, then these same monks of Solesmes start to record editions of their chants. And they have given us the style of singing chant, which most people are familiar with. For example, if you guys are ever in a CD store and you see the CDs which are labeled Chant and they're blue with clouds in the background and monks are flying, those are made by the monks of Santo Domingo de Silos. But the style is very much based on what these monks of Solesmes came up with. And there are some who don't agree with that style. The style that the monks of Solesmes came up with is based on you counting the chant in terms of groups of 2 and 3. Since then, some research has been done by Marcel Perez and some other groups that's very, very different, and they feel the chant was probably more influenced by Arabs and Arabic music. They think it may have been influenced also by the Middle East and had a drone with it, which is highly possible. I don't think anything exists in a vacuum, but since the 1930s, many people have taken this approach to chant, and it's up to you to decide which one you think might be more authentic. So now, the rise of the Mass and the office. Told you I'd tell you about the office. The development of Christian liturgy occurred from pretty much the 2nd century through the year 800, of course, and then we know Charlemagne does a good deal for Christianity. And between the years 800 and 1000, we start to see notation. Eventually in 1000, we actually have notation that's on a staff, so it's very precise. And once we have all of these things written down, we have 2 main types of worship that are being used in the Christian church: the Mass, which is the celebration of the Last Supper, and the office, which is the chanting of the 150 psalms by the monks through a process of several meetings a day. I'd like to say just a brief word about these next couple of slides. While you can certainly read through the charts yourselves, I just want to clarify this chart is basically about the differences between the Mass and the office, where they were held, what was performed there, as well as the different events that were important in each of those settings. So I'll let you guys take a look at this, but I'd like you to know the difference between the text collection and the music collection, and the things that happened in each event that were important. Now for the parts of the Mass, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, they're arranged into three parts: the introductory, the liturgy of the Word, and the liturgy of the Eucharist. And we have what is called the proper, or text and music, which always is changing depending upon the time of year, and the ordinary, which does not change depending upon the time of year. You'll notice there are a lot of three-part forms, such as the Kyrie. The KCK 3 times means Kyrie eleison, which was sung 3 times, Christe eleison, which was sung 3 times, Kyrie eleison again 3 times. So a total of 9 parts. This is the only Greek text in the Mass, and it deals with the words, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. Then if you look down in the Liturgy of the Eucharist under the Ordinary, we have the Sanctus, which is also a 3-part form, usually A, B, and then B prime, meaning just slightly different than B. Now that we understand the parts of the Mass, let's take a look at some examples of the music of the Mass. So, if you guys wouldn't mind turning in your Norton Anthology texts, I always refer to them as the NAM text, Norton Anthology of Western Music, to page 17, where you can find the Credo, which is part of the Ordinary of the Mass, and we'll just take a look at some things together here. I encourage, once we're done talking about this, that you listen to the Credo, which should be on your CD set, and it should be track number 18. So, as you look at the Credo, first see if you can find that movable C clef, which looks like a tiny telephone, and that's going to tell you where middle C is. In this case, our tiny telephone is on the top line of the staff, and our first note, that means our first note is a G. And then we end on page 19, actually on an E, okay? So just getting used to reading this block notation can be a little bit challenging, but I want to give you guys some clues here. There'll also be some times where you'll see 2 notes attached, and that actually happens in the second bar, so to speak, of music on the word patrem. They're kind of piled on top of each other. That is called a ligature. That means that those notes were originally attached in the notation, the original notation. The way you read that is the lower note first, and then the upper note afterwards. Accidentals, as you can see, were also used in this music. We have a B flat in that, again, that second measure of music on patrem. Lots of B flats elsewhere in the piece as well. You'll probably notice as you look at the Credo that there are several types of repeating phrases that occur over and over and over again. Especially when you listen to it, it'll be very obvious, but even just looking at it, you can see a lot of these things. This repeating of certain phrases has to do with the oral tradition of chant. Before it was written down, you would have to learn everything entirely by ear, so having repetitious patterns is very useful. That helps the monks memorize music much more easily. The Credo, which is the summation of the beliefs of the Christian Church, is probably one of the longest texts that we have in the Mass. And you'll notice as well, the music is very simple for that reason. We don't have a lot of crazy melismas on any of these words. Very simple, repetitive, so the monks could get through that text more quickly. The reason that this is sung as part of the ordinary at every Mass is, again, as I said, this is the cornerstone of the Christian faith, the summation of the beliefs of the Church. So let's take a look at a second example, the music from the proper, the Tui sunt celi. This is on page 20, and that is the offertory for the day. So that is in fact part of the proper. You will notice that our C clef is actually in the same place. It's on that top line once again, but it is movable, so we may look at other chants where it's on a different line or even a space. So we begin on an F this time. You guys could probably guess that by looking at where the C is. And we end on an E. And notice how this chant is a bit different than the credo in the way that it's written. It is much more florid and has a lot more notes on each word and many ligatures, as I'm sure you guys can see. Since this is part of the proper, which changes, it was also very likely sung by a soloist. Usually proper chants are more complicated and complex, and usually for that reason were sung by soloists instead of choirs, because it's easier with one person to negotiate all of those different melismas than with a group of people. So you can see it is possible for this chant to be even more ornate than what we saw in the credo. And it's very likely that the credo would have been performed by a larger group of people. It could be done by the choir, another reason for the musical simplicity.